Yeah. Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, it gives me a great pleasure to welcome here today at the Academy of Sciences, Vienna. This is actually our first workshop with presence and a hybrid form. Special welcome to those who are participating in today's conference via the live stream. The theme of today is we have these rapid developments of information and communication technologies, and their widespread use are leading to a transformation called digitizations of society as a whole. There have been many buzzwords recently. It started with the broadband networks, mobile services, 5G, social media, cloud computing, Internet of Things, big data, and now artificial intelligence, just to name a few. With each of these developmental steps came the promise of economic benefits, acceleration, and increased efficiency. The improvement of communication possibilities was meant to be a push forward to democratization, because everyone could create the content. Consumers should become prosumers. That was one of the expectations. However, if you look at the real developments, you have to admit that many of these expectations and promises have not been fulfilled. And there have been even quite negative developments. So to say, the erosion of privacy, more surveillance in private and governmental form, here coming with the promise of generating more security. Manipulation through behavioral analysis, nudging in the private sphere, predictive policing, and even applications that are particularly problematic in terms of democratic policy, such as micro-targeting and the exploitation of reinforcement of so-called filter bubbles. These bubbles, mutually reinforcing, lead to polarization and therefore have a negative impact on the culture of discussion and debate. So these developments are to be countered with a comprehensive legal framework. The first internationally significant step was the introduction of the GDPR in 2018 as a basic legislation for the handling of personal data and the individual protection rights based on it, in addition to other legal activities, e.g. with regard to law enforcement agencies. The Commission's draft on AI, on the AI Act, is currently the subject of controversial discussion. The different pace of development between technology, economy, politics, and legislation led to a constant need for adaptation. And this is where Panelfit project comes in. With today's meeting, Managing a Secure Future with AI, Too Many Guidelines and Too Little Guidance, we start a series of concluding events of this important project. The other events will take place in Brussels and Cologne on the 30th of March, and in Brussels again on the 31st of March. The first Brussels meeting and the one in Cologne will be fully online. The second meeting on the 31st in Brussels will be hybrid as ours here in Vienna. For further details, please visit the Panelfit homepage at panelfit.eu. Over the last 3.5 years, the team of the ITER has been working with colleagues from another 12 European partner institutions on processes for new ethical and legal frameworks for ICT. There is a need for society, as I said before, and politics and the economy to adapt quickly to these new conditions evolving from the permanent change in the IT landscape. The Panelfit project aims to help to shape these processes such a way that innovation opportunities can be exploited without impairing fundamental rights and security. The ITER has been mainly responsible for the topic security and cybersecurity within the project. Thus, Panelfit fits perfectly into the ITER's portfolio. In addition to its focus on innovation, the environment and sustainable futures, and emerging technosciences, values and uncertainty, ITER has a significant focus on digital technology, democracy, and society. With a long-standing history of studies on privacy and other fundamental rights on the one hand, and security policy on the other, with a widespread dissemination and increase of AI, new challenges are indeed emerging, and this will be also discussed today. In this spirit, sorry for not introducing myself, my name is Walter Peisel. I'm a Deputy Director of ITER. On behalf of ITER and the Academy of Sciences, wish you all a productive meeting and a warm welcome to Vienna again. Thank you.
Thank you, Walter. My name is Jaro Krieger-Lamina. I also work at the Institute of Technology Assessment at the Austrian Academy of Sciences. And we will have another welcome message from the coordinator of the Panelfit project, Professor Carlos Maria Romeo Casabona from the University of the Basque Country. And afterwards from Inigo de Miguel Perian, also from the University of the Basque Country, who will explain about the ongoing and the status of the Panelfit project. Could you switch to Carlos Maria, to the Zoom link, please?
Yeah. So, dear colleagues and friends, and also invited people to attend this dissemination seminar. Good afternoon to everybody. Given that I have academic duties to fulfill at my university at this very hour, it has not been possible for me to be present at this meeting, and I must make do with these brief words of greeting and welcome online. As maybe you know, Panelfit, participatory approaches to a new ethical and legal framework for ICT, is an European Commission funded project by the SWAF's Science with and for Society program. Panelfit is integrated of 12 multidisciplinary groups from European countries with expertise in the fields of law, social communication, ICT, and other. It is coordinated by myself with the collaboration of Inigo de Miguel, who acts as associate coordinator, both from the University of the Basque Country here in Spain. When we submitted the application for this project to the European Commission, we were aware that the regulatory framework on data protection was changing dramatically. In fact, it was only recently that the important General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, was approved by the European institutions. Taking into account this important new legal framework for Europe, 27 European countries, we took as a main objective to encourage the creation of data markets that enable fair data commercialization while ensuring at the same time the protection of autonomy through decisive support of individual informed consent, but also supporting the implementation of sustainable security systems, including in that cybersecurity. Thus, from the basic idea, we draw the three pillars of the project. The first one, data commercialization. The second one is informed consent. And the third one, security and cybersecurity. Consequently, the four main objectives of Panelfit, as you know, are: first, to facilitate the implementation of this new regulation by producing a set of outcomes that serve as operational standards and practical guidelines, able to reduce the ethical and legal issues posed by ICT, while promoting innovation and market growth, enabling high-quality job creation, and assuring a high level of privacy and security and cyber security. Secondly, to suggest possible concrete improvements to the current regulatory and governance framework for the same purpose. Thirdly, to create mutual learning and support tools and to promote networking among stakeholders and policy makers. And finally, to increase the quantity and quality of the information available to policy makers, professionals, journalists, and lay people. As derived tasks of the former main objectives, to provide applicable guidelines and recommendations and disseminations activities, among other, are the most relevant activities. After my welcome, Íñigo de Miguel will explain you the main and the most relevant outcomes of Panelfit along these last years. With this afternoon's meeting here or there in Vienna, we want to continue our activities on these matters as we have already done in Madrid, the last times in Madrid, we will do in Cologne and Brussels, and including also in Italy, among other places. Today's topic in Vienna will be managing a secure future with AI. Too many guidelines and too little guidance is the question mark. Before giving way to the other interventions this afternoon, I would like to thank Johann Čas for having taken charge of the organization of the event and for having been able to convene such a qualified panel of speakers. To them, to the speakers, I extend my welcome and my thanks, my warmest thanks as well. So I will finish my presentation and my words of welcome. I would just like to wish you all an enjoyable meeting and that all those who wish to participate in agreement with the organizers can do so in order to make the meeting as fruitful as possible. Thank you very much to all of you and enjoy the meeting. Bye.
Thank you, Professor. Íñigo, please go on with the presentation about the Panelfit project.
Yeah, thank you so much, Charles. Can you hear me well?
I'm fine, thanks.
Yeah. So first of all, let me apologize that I'm not there. In any case, I really hope that we will meet at some point in the next months. Especially, I must tell personally that I am especially thankful to the team of ITA. It's been an enormous pleasure to work with Jaro, with Johann, and with Walter. Really, I mean, we all know that it's been a long time now, almost 3.5 years, and we have been together, you know, in some very good times, in not so good times, in all type of times, I guess. And it's been really a pleasure and an honor to work with you. So I'm really delightful to somehow be able to at least recognize that. And so once I'm telling you that, I also must, you know, congratulate you for this panel. I know the speakers and really, you know, the type of people that I would have choose if I were me to decide. So you did it. That was fantastic and really thankful for that. Congrats. So I will just introduce a little bit what we have done in the Panelfit project. Please take my word, it will not be more than 10 minutes. So I will try not to be so boring, okay? Because you have a very, very interesting things to do. So I'm just trying to share my screen right now. And I guess that you should be now seeing my screen. Yeah, I think that's the case. So we'll just put that in a presentation mode. You're feeling the whole of the screen with that. Yeah. So Professor Romeo has already introduced the Panelfit project. It's all about data protection issues mainly. And you know from the very beginning that this was aimed to a quite simply to understand goal. I remember when we were just first starting with the drafts of the proposals, just working together, especially with Johann and with Björk, our Danish colleague, that we were just thinking how to deal with something like so that was as as impressive as the data protection regulation and so on. Well, at the present moment, we are not only having this General Data Protection Regulation, but also the Artificial Intelligence Act and the Data Governance Act and the Data Act out there somewhere. So everything is going to become even more complicated. So what we tried to do during these years really was to try to make things a little bit easier, both for those policymakers who had to introduce these new materials and for the end users that will really have to deal with that. So in the Panelfit project, we are just creating something that is kind of set of outcomes. I dare say 6 main outcomes that have been produced during this project. And I will try to introduce them quite briefly. First of all, and this is very well known by my Austrian colleagues, a critical analysis. A critical analysis is a document that it's mainly a report that it's considering what we have right now, how the regulatory situation is, and how this could be improved somehow. So we were just analyzing what we have and introducing some kind of proposals. Most probably some of the things that we were saying in this report will be incorporated in the next months or in the next 2 years with the new regulations. We don't really know, but I think that most of our suggestions are really somehow there. Some others not, of course, but at least we are just pointing out some possible solutions that could really make things better at the regulatory level. So this is the first that we have, that is a critical analysis. Then we have a report on governance. I think this is gonna be a very interesting report and will become the more important in the future. I don't know what Christine is gonna say in the next presentation. I'm really looking forward to hearing that. But in my honest opinion, one of the things that really will be very difficult and something that we will have to deal with is the supervisory bodies that will have to deal with artificial intelligence and data protection, and data governance in the next year. So in this report, we were more or less just stating what was the current situation, what was the role to be played by the ethics committees. And this was really a very interesting document produced by EREC, that is the European Network of Research Ethics Committees. So they were just trying to tell us how they were dealing with this and what could be done to improve the current situation. Then we have the next one, that is a code of conduct. We are proposing in Panelfit a code of conduct that could serve well for those who are dealing with data protection issues. And this might be useful in 2 different ways. Somehow it could become an official code of conduct when we are trying to push for that, because you know that GDPR allows for a kind of official code of conduct. But even if it were not, if it does not become a real official code of conduct, we will have something like a code of conduct for responsible research and innovation in the specific field of ICT and so on. And this could be very helpful, especially taking into account the new regulations and the AI regulations regarding some minimal risk tools and so on. So this could be somehow useful for them, or could be. Then we have the handbook for journalists. That is a very interesting outcome that we have produced. This was really based on a kind of idea that we had in mind, is that journalists use a lot of data. It's essential for their profession, and usually they are not so well aware of what they can do and they cannot. And on the other side, we really need journalists to do the work in a best possible way, because somehow those are the ones who are protecting us in so many ways and providing good information. So we were just helping them to do that thanks to this kind of handbook for them. And then we have a citizen info pack. That is quite some materials that have been produced to help citizens understand the rights and how they could really make the best use of the data and feel protected. And we especially developed a special version that was adapted to vulnerable population, and we are really quite proud of that. And finally, maybe, but last but not least, and in this case it is really last but not least, one of the most important outcomes is what we call the guidelines. Guidelines is a very, very important thing that we have that has to do with something that really means providing a practical advice for those who are dealing with this. So here you get a kind of an impression of the guidelines in the Panelfit project produced by us. This is a very interactive tool. You could take a look at that if you wish. The link is there and it's publicly accessible. And this contains lots and lots of information about the GDPR and how you could deal with that. So for example, you take a look at the left column, there are the main concepts, the main principles, main actors, data subject rights, and so on. So if you just pick one of them, you will receive the information about what it is, the different rights, and so on. It's been created in a way that some windows open, so as whoever is using that can perfectly know what this is about precisely. And there are also lots of check boxes just to make it very practical and easy for them to understand whether they are really accomplishing with the regulation or not. And of course, we have created that with accessibility tools, so as you could increase text, decrease text, or do whatever you feel more comfortable to you. So this is more or less the outcomes that we have. I will just come back for a second just to give you something very simple information about communication and dissemination and the things that we have done. Lots of different things. We have created, of course, academic papers, panels, and workshops, and all the rest. But we have also introduced some more courses, both to end users and to researchers and so on. We have had encounters with lots of stakeholders and policymakers, and we are also creating this series of final events. This is one of them, of course. But another thing that we are quite proud of is that we have a lot of impact, social impact, thanks to lots of publication in El País, En el Mundo, Corriere della Sera, and so on. And especially and particularly, I would like to add that we are especially proud that we think that we really provide nice advice on data protection issues and public health in the context of COVID, something that I think it was really helpful in so many ways. So that's more or less what I would like to tell you. There are some more things that you could look in our webpage, but I think that this is more than enough. So just let me finish at this concrete moment. Thank you again, everyone, for coming here, for your attention. Thank you so much for my Austrian colleagues. Really appreciate you all. Man, thank you so much for all your help during this project. And the floor is again yours. Okay, thank you so much. I will remain here, just of course, keeping an open eye to the next presentation. I'm willing to hear. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Nico. Now, my colleague Johann Čas is giving a short introduction into the topic of our event today.
Okay. Thanks to Walter, Carlos, and Inigo for the warm welcome, the introductory words, and brief presentation of the Panelfit project. Thanks also to the keynote speakers and the participants of the panel discussion that follows. And of course, to everyone who accepted our invitation to this event in person or virtually. What is it about this afternoon? As already mentioned, the Panelfit project is looking at ethical and legal challenges of emerging information and communication technologies, with security and cybersecurity being one of the 3 focal points of the Panelfit project. I will move to the theme of today, managing a secure future with AI. Too many guidelines, too little guidance. Security is a multi-layered, changing, and often contradictory concept. Within the framework of this project, these 12 issues, which are shown on the slide, were selected in a participatory process for the area of security and examined in more detail. As you can see, they concern very different levels and topics, which still could be supplemented or expanded in many ways. And the relevance of individual aspects can change rapidly. As a result of the Russian Federation's invasion of Ukraine, for example, questions of military security and thus, for example, the delivery of intelligent drones have taken on a significance that was unimaginable until a few weeks ago. Nor could it have been foreseen that a pandemic would change our lives so dramatically. that we will need masks and certificates to participate today in person. The issues identified range from fundamental disputes, such as the relationship between security and surveillance, to freedom and privacy, from individual, societal, economic, and political aspects of specific and to specific applications. Today, we will not aim to find valid answers to all of the questions raised in the project or to newly emerging ones. The domains involved are too complex, the perceived threats too diverse, and the answers to these questions correspondingly complex and contradictory. We must therefore inevitably limit ourselves to certain aspects and at the same time try to do justice to the diversity of the concept of security. Technical progress in ICT allows or entails that more and more functions and areas are permeated by them. The accompanying possibilities of surveilling our lives, our actions, our interests, our preferences, bring with them corresponding losses of privacy. AI technologies are a key means of analyzing the vast amount of data and thus also a common tool to address many security issues. That is why this afternoon we want to focus on the relationship between AI and fundamental rights. If data is the oil of the 21st century, then AI technologies are also the engines for harnessing that data. One of my central theses is that in order to avoid the dramatic consequences of the use of fossil energies for the natural environment and for global warming, we must do everything we can to avoid a repetition, to prevent data from polluting the social climate, from surveillance leading to a global chilling of individual and societal freedoms. We see how ICTs are used to heat up the political climate, how they are utilized to aggregate economic power and generate corresponding dependencies, how social networks can lead to personal isolation, how automated decisions threaten to undermine human autonomy, and how freedom of expression is threatened. A second thesis would be that the development and use of AI technologies in accordance with fundamental rights is one of the central prerequisites for progress that is not limited to higher performance and the improvement of technical capabilities, but serves human needs and social advancement. If we agree with these theses, they raise a number of further questions. To what extent might existing regulations be sufficient to ensure the development and use of new technologies in accordance with fundamental rights? If not, are these regulations insufficient or not enforced strictly enough, or both? And as already said, the draft AI Act has provoked very different reactions. The initial enthusiasm that non-binding recommendations are finally, for the first time ever, to be cast into a body of law has given way to increasing skepticism. Does this draft act bring about an improvement, or does it represent even a step backwards compared to the GDPR? And not, of course, the general question, how can ethics, law and technology be combined to achieve a secure future without restricting fundamental rights? I would like to end here, and I'm very much looking forward to the two keynotes and exciting discussions afterwards. Thank you, and here you can also find again the link to the project and to its reports.
Thank you, Johann. We had an introduction with a lot of open questions, not easy to answer. And I'm very glad to introduce our first keynote speaker today, Professor Christiane Wendehorst. Professor Wendehorst is currently co-head of the Department of Innovation and Digitalization in Law at the University of Vienna and the scientific director of the European Law Institute. Since 2008, she has been professor for civil law at the University of Vienna, and before she was teaching professor at the University of Göttingen and Greifswald in Germany. She also chairs the Academic Council of the Austrian Academy of Sciences. She is a member of the Bioethics Commission at the Austrian Federal Chancellery, member of the Managing Board of the Austrian Jurists Association, member of the Academia Europaea, the International Academy for Comparative Law, and the American Law Institute. At the moment, her research focuses on legal aspects of digitalization, and she's been working as an expert on topics such as digital content, the Internet of Things, AI and data economy, amongst others, for the European Commission, the European Parliament, and the German federal government. In the years 2018 and 19, she co-chaired also the Data Ethics Commission of the German federal government. More recently, she was European leader of the transatlantic project Principles for Data Economy and led various other projects in the area of digitalization and topics such as safety and liability-related aspects of software and biometric techniques. She is also involved in a number of projects on algorithmic fairness, and I'm very happy, glad, and looking forward to her keynote, where she probably will tell us whether the way or the evolution from GDPR to the AI Act solved a lot of our problems today. For now, we will go on, and I have the pleasure to introduce our next keynote speaker, Professor Charles Raab. Professor Charles Raab is at the moment Professorial Fellow of the School of Social and Political Science at the University of Edinburgh, having held the chair of government for the years from 1999 to 2007, and later for the years from 2012 to 15. He has served as a member of the academic staff since 1964 and has held visiting positions in the Oxford Internet Institute, the Tilburg Institute of Law, Technology and Society, the Queen's University, or the Victoria University of Wellington, just to name a few. He was a fellow of the Hanse Wissenschaftskolleg in Delmenhorst, Germany, and currently he is a Turing Fellow at the Alan Turing Institute, where he also is a member of the Data Ethics Group. With colleagues of the Universities of Stirling, St. Andrews and Essex, he is the director of the Centre for Research into Information, Surveillance and Privacy, and he is the founder of the Scottish Privacy Forum. He is a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences, as well as a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. He was the specialist advisor to the House of Lords Select Committee on the Constitution's current inquiry into the impact of surveillance and data collection upon the privacy of citizens and their relationship with the state. He is also co-chair of the Independent Digital Ethics Panel for Policing, and his actual research interests at the moment are mostly into public policy and governance, including British government, information policy, privacy protection, and public access to information, and information technology in democratic politics, government, and commerce. At the moment, he is also working at a research project named Path AI, which is the acronym for Mapping an Intercultural Path to Privacy, Agency and Trust in Human AI Ecosystems. And I'm very glad to greet you here from Vienna to Edinburgh. And yes, please, Charles, start with your presentation.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? I'm very sorry that I can't be with you in Vienna, which is one of my favorite cities, but I haven't been able to be there today. So I hope this is an acceptable substitute. I'd like to see if I can share the screen just now. How do I do that? I think I'm not being very successful with this, and I wonder whether my slideshow, which I have here, can be, oh, here we go. Let me see.
Yeah, that's good.
Can that be seen?
I think we see your desktop now with the open PowerPoint presentation.
You can see it now?
Yeah, we can see your slides.
Good. Do you see the whole slide, or do you see something else on the right?
It's not presentation mode, but we see the slides in the PowerPoint.
Yeah, let me see if I can adjust that. I'm not sure where I go to do that. Here we go. No. Is the whole slide visible, or do you see pictures of the members present?
No, we see the whole slide. It would be okay if you go on.
You see the
like
whole
this.
slide. Okay, that's fine then. Okay, I was very interested to hear Christiane's talk, and I think that although we are dealing with some of the same kinds of issues, I'm putting it in a somewhat different perspective and moving it away from looking at the law to looking at ethics and other practical aspects of the, not so much the GDPR, but also the AI proposal, the AI Act, and other similar or related proposals that have become available. And so let me move my next slide. Oh, how do I move my next slide? There we are. What I'm focusing on today are three broad areas. The ethical background of these documents, GDPR, AIA, and looking also at other recommendations, including UNESCO's. And then what I want to do is to focus particularly on security and safety and the way in which they relate to regulation and the way we think about the regulating the technologies and so forth. My presentation draws upon a couple of articles that Hilke Heemans of the Dutch Data Protection Authority and I have published in recent years. I'm not going to talk about those papers. You can have them available and look at them if you wish. Also, I should say that while I have rather a lot of slides with sometimes rather a lot of text on them, it's not intended to be, I'm not intending to speak to all of the slides or all of the written text. But I thought it was be worthwhile to have a complete slideshow so that anybody wanting to have that available and read it later on after this Panelfit event, you're welcome to have that. First, I want to ask some very, very general questions. When we talk about law and ethics and what the relationship is between them, there are many different things you could say about them. Are they separate domains, separate dimensions, or are they somehow interwoven? And if they are interwoven, in what kind of patterns? How do they relate to each other? Could ethics be seen as soft law and conversely law seen as hard ethics? Because in the law, you have a substantial ethical content, normative content, which has roots in ethics in a more formal sense. And then when we talk about law, in this area? Are we only talking about statutory law? Are we talking about general law, like a general data protection regulation, or a specific law like the AI Act, or indeed company law, as we've heard addressed in the previous keynote, company law and technology-related law and so forth. So it isn't simply law, but particular facets of law that one might want to look at. And then comes the question of, must ethics necessarily mean self-regulation? There are a lot of people who criticize ethical approaches in this area because they think, oh, ethics, this is simply a matter of companies wanting to regulate themselves and let themselves off the hook very, very lightly. And I'm not sure whether that is the beginning and the end of ethics. And then the last question we might want to ask is, how do ethics relate to human rights? One sees in recent years an emphasis upon human rights, fundamental human rights. And when you talk to people who are promoting that, and you say, well, what about ethics? And they say, well, ethics is one thing, human rights is another thing. Well, is that necessarily the case? So I'm not going to answer all of those questions, but those are some things that we might want to ponder about. If we talk about individual rights, individual rights are there not only to protect the individual, but I would contend that they are there to protect society as a whole. They are full of societal values that society would be poorer without having. If you can look at privacy or data protection as not just an individual thing, but as a socially crucial, constitutive set of rules, which are maybe underappreciated in formal written law. They constitute public good, and we should be talking about the public good and public benefit. An example of this is that if data protection is very weak, it's a disincentive for people to give accurate and up-to-date and full information to the public services, to doctors, to hospitals, to the census, to official statistics, and so on. And therefore, the quality of public service data is compromised if people don't have confidence in the protection of their personal data. So there is a kind of social dimension to having good data protection law and practice. Another example is the accuracy requirement in Article 5 of the GDPR, which underpins the right to rectification of one's data held by a company or a public sector organization, and therefore to help to increase the quality of those data. And another example is the general assumption that public trust and confidence will be enhanced for the data-driven economy and data-driven society. Now, we may be ambivalent about whether that's a very worthy goal, but there we are. And questions one could ask is the individual rights route to societal values, in other words, going through something like the GDPR in order to get to societal values and benefits, is that a too indirect route to safeguarding society and safeguarding fundamental rights? Can they be realized more directly through reliance to some extent upon ethics? Well, let me look at ethics both before and beyond the GDPR. There's been a recent, as we all know, a recent turn to ethics with a great proliferation of ethical codes of practice, 80 or 90 of them, ethics advisory processes, ethics groups, greater awareness of data ethics and principles. A lot of talk about ethics. Now, there are critics and there are supporters of that turn to ethics. The critics would say, this is all ethics washing. It's all blah, blah, blah. It's all formulaic. It's all pious. It's very powerless. It's cosmetic. It's vague on what ethics means, and it ignores fundamental rights. Some critics also say this is simply reputational risk back covering by organizations who jump on the bandwagon in order to protect their reputations rather than genuinely to alleviate risks and prevent harms to the general public. And the critics also say how it's very unclear how ethics relates to legal requirements and what ethics would impose upon or forbid to people who say, well, we are simply following the law and the law is good enough for us, so go away. What do the supporters of ethical approaches say? Well, they say that ethics complements and underpins, but doesn't substitute for legal rules, and that it shows that there is a thoughtfulness, a ferment in the thinking, a reassessment of practitioners getting to grips with the extra-legal implications of their innovations and of their practice, and that it encourages thought about how you solve wicked dilemmas, and it moves away from simply liability-related compliance routines that companies would like to take, even though they don't necessarily like to comply with the law, as we also know. Supporters also say that ethics points to the societal dimension of these things, as I've mentioned, and not just individual rights, that the law is too complicated and vague and also inadequate to go directly to those rights. Well, in the GDPR, I don't want to go into this in too great detail, but there's recital 4 about the processing of personal data should be designed to serve mankind. And here we have all kinds of very, very good words in recital 4 of the GDPR: respect for private and family life, the home and communications. I won't read the rest because you know all of them. They're about freedoms and the right to a fair trial and cultural diversity and so forth. And these are mostly ethical, they're enshrined in the law, but they're ethical norms and ethical values. They weren't simply invented by lawyers without any cognizance being taken of the ethical underpinnings of them. Also in the GDPR, there are elements of principle-based regulation and not just rules-based regulation. But the ethical considerations are, as Hilke Hiemans and I have written, are sometimes obscure and hidden away in various articles, and I'm not going to go into those. The ethical considerations are concealed, and they're not always apparent. They're intermittent, they're fragmentary. You have to find them and hunt for them in all the recitals and in all of the articles. And it seems that the GDPR could have drawn from a wider range of ethical principles, which I think in the years since the GDPR was being drafted have now come more closely into focus concerning human rights, for example. If you look at the European Charter of Fundamental Rights, the term human dignity only is mentioned once, and that's only once in the GDPR, in Article 88, where it has to do with processing in the context of employment. Now, that's a very, very limited way of referring to human dignity by simply only putting it into provisions for processing in employments. By way of contrast, the European Data Protection Supervisor, the late Giovanni Buttarelli, was very, very keen on human dignity as a mainspring for the work that he was doing and how it could be perhaps inserted into the ecosystem of data protection more forcefully. And perhaps we see things like human dignity coming about a bit more forcefully now. Well, what about the idea of fairness? And this was mentioned a while ago. That's an ethical dimension which is central to data protection laws, but what is meant by fairness? I'm not going to go into that point, particularly at the moment, but as you will, I'm sure know, fairness is being debated, it's being worked on mathematically by computer scientists and data scientists to kind of cash in the wonderful word of fairness into some usable techniques and tools for producing fairness in algorithms or in other kinds of outputs from artificial intelligence. Now, some of the recitals and the articles in some of the recitals and also Article 51 elaborate on fairness, and they associate it with transparency. Well, you could argue that transparency, yes, is part of fairness, but it also is a standalone requirement on its own. So the relationship between transparency itself and fairness is something that I think needs to be smoothed out. You find that transparency or openness and accountability have come on very strongly as important principles and as important practices and rules in recent years. And both transparency and accountability address the ethical and the practical relationship between controllers and processors of personal data on the one hand and individuals on the other. So that's a kind of ethical drive that we find in the GDPR, such as it is. Well, let's move a bit from the GDPR to the AI Act. Now, if the GDPR renewed and strengthened the legal rules and related ethical precepts, and also gave it a wider geographical reach and helped to reform regulatory machinery, the AI challenges many of the norms and values and the laws that were framed only in terms of data protection or privacy or with regard to personal data. And it's questionable whether the adequacy of concepts like data protection and privacy and personal data, whether these are still adequate concepts in the regulatory and governance ecosystem that has evolved and that is further evolving in the context of artificial intelligence and algorithms and derived profiling, as Christiane was pointing out. The AI Act exemplifies a further turn to global, ethical, moral, human rights, legal thinking in specifically with regard to AI. If you look, for example, at the GDPR, the European Commission's high-level expert group on artificial intelligence of 2019, which came about after the GDPR was done and dusted. The turn to ethics, of course, is very manifest in that. Is also, if you look at projects and reports by the Fundamental Rights Agency, the FRA, if you look at the Council of Europe, the OECD, UNESCO, my own, the Alan Turing Institute and others, ethics is very much front and center in terms of advanced artificial intelligence applications. I'll mention something about some of those initiatives in a little while. So there's now, yet again, a further profusion of frameworks and principles and documents which enshrine ethical things. And if you want to be cynical, you could say déjà vu, déjà lu, déjà su, already seen, already read, already known. The FRA identified about 350 AI policy initiatives. So alongside the ethical turn, there are also the turn in policy initiatives to implement regulations, to implement ethical principles. And the question we are left with is, does the draft AI Act adequately deal with all of these ethical issues? And I think that's very much open to debate. Here's an example of something recent, the Council of Europe AI principles of 2020. And they mention, now we're not going to read these out, you can read them yourself, they're unexceptionable. Yeah, who would disagree? Yes, there's human dignity, in fact, mentioned as number one, prevention of harms. There is transparency, there is accountability and responsibility. There is democracy, which I think is not really much talked about in previous documents. And of course, the rule of law, human autonomy, or human agency, as one might say, and other human freedoms, gender equality, diversity. So the Council of Europe has picked up principles that go beyond the first turn to ethics. Now let's go back a little bit to the draft AI Act, and just a few key points. I've quoted there from the explanatory memorandum, in which it talks about a balanced and proportionate regulatory approach limited to the minimum necessary requirements to address risks and problems without unduly constraining or hindering technological development, so or disproportionately increasing the cost of solutions on the market. So there already you find a kind of limitation to what it could be as an act regulating AI. They don't want to upset the economy. They don't want to upset innovation. They don't want to upset data-driven developments. They don't want to put disproportionate burdens on market participants. So that original thing in the explanatory memorandum already puts us on our guard to what the limits of regulating AI might be in terms of the Draft AI Act. They do mention many times fundamental rights, trustworthiness, freedom, transparency, and they do, as Christiane pointed out, have a risk-based approach in which the heaviest regulation is for situations of high risk to fundamental rights, but also safety from the use of AI as part of products, considering the intended purpose of the products. And one can, I'll come back to this, I think, in a little bit. There are shortcomings in all of that. Yes, of course, there are prohibitions. In Article 5, I'm not going to read these out, but they have to do with subliminal techniques beyond a person's consciousness. Well, that's a very peculiar way of stating what this Article 5 is all about, but also putting limits on what it can do. And also the exploitation of the vulnerabilities of a specific group due to various characteristics, and the estimation of likely physical or psychological harm. So those are some of the prohibitions. There's some more. Prohibitions on public authority systems for classifying people in relationship to their social behavior. I'm not going to read out all of these words. And also under Article 5D, the use of real-time remote biometric identification systems in publicly accessible spaces for the purpose of law enforcement. So already it's really rather narrowly constrained are those prohibitions. Doesn't mention the private sector in terms of classification of people, and also doesn't mention non-real-time biometric identification systems. Those are just two of the criticisms one might make. Well, what have been the commentaries on the Draft AI Act? As you may know, the consultation that was put out received some 304 submissions, plus there are many other academic and other commentaries on the Draft AI Act. I've not read all 304 submissions, but I've read a fair proportion of them, and I find some of them very interesting and worth consideration, as we will see in a few minutes. Most of the commentaries, most of the consultation responses favored legal regulation in principle, but worried about the gaps and the uncertainties, the loopholes, and all of the rest. They challenge, some of the people challenge the risk basis on the grounds that it's ambiguous, that it's arbitrary, and that it ignores unintended consequences. I can come back to that a little bit. But also that the product safety model is seen by many critics as a very doubtful analogy, and very doubtful in terms of how you govern that, and how it will work out in practice. Because after all, AI is not like a toaster where you can talk about the safety of a product in fairly simple terms. So the analogy really isn't all that terrific, and why I don't know the inner stories about how the AI Act was drafted, but to lean on a product safety model seems like a step too easy to take in order to regulate AI. Also, some critics say that it's very formulaic, that while it might mention fundamental rights and other ethical norms and principles, that there is very little depth or conviction. It's the same boilerplate phrases being rolled out in recitals and clauses and so on. So it gives really little depth or conviction. That's what some of the commentaries do say. Here are some that I've picked out as being perhaps quite interesting. There's some commentaries on risk, on the risk-based approach, which has been given by the Information Accountability Foundation, which is a private sector, business-oriented group of people who have been increasingly talking about ethics in recent years. I'm not going to read these out again, but again, they criticize the relationship between the AI Act and the so-called conformity assessments that are specified, and they are criticizing the way conformity assessments might happen with regard to product safety, where you do have established standards, and you can see whether the product conforms to those standards. But with regard to AI, there are no established standards, and so why should a conformity assessment be thought to be a good approach for regulating AI? There are further commentaries on the question of harm. And this is from Mireille Hildebrandt, whom some of you may know, Professor Hildebrandt. She says that negative impacts are not limited to the level of individual harm. That what about the public sphere? What about democratic processes? What about the public goods, as I mentioned before, which are part and parcel of what we would like to have in the way of understanding and appreciating privacy and other human rights. There are also a very, very good article by Michael Veal and Frederick Zouteveen-Borgesius, who talk about in terms of harm, the loopholes in looking at manipulative AI systems, if they are unlikely to cause an individual harm, that there's a loophole there. They also point out about the emotional classification of people on emotional grounds, whereas further downstream in the way in which AI gets used, things become harmful rather than at the first step. So I would invite you to read their criticism about these points concerning harm, and likewise Mireille Hildebrandt's feedback to the commentaries given directly to the European Commission for the AI Act. There are also some commentaries about technology, about impact and about responsibility. A group called Algorithm Watch has said that the need to regulate a system shouldn't be triggered by what kind of technology it is, AI or machine learning or something, but should be triggered by the impact that it has on individuals and society, and that is insufficiently emphasized within the AI Act. There's also further feedback, interestingly, by Google. And Google says that if you talk about the provider of an AI system, that is to ignore the whole chain of things that go on beyond the initial provider, a whole class of deployers before you get to the ultimate end user. And the term user, by the way, as we all may appreciate, is a very, very ambiguous and unspecific term because there are all kinds of intermediate users. And Google is saying a new class of deployers should be charged with responsibility for complying with the regulatory requirements. So that's another very interesting comment that's been made. And finally, there's some commentaries on the biometric identification. Here, once again, Miri Hildebrandt has made some remarks there about the limitations of what is prohibited in the way of biometric identification systems and categorization and emotional recognition. And she emphasizes the importance of democracy and human dignity as part of this, which is missed out in a kind of safety, product safety model of regulation. Let me turn now very, very briefly to look at the preamble to the UNESCO draft recommendation on the ethics of AI. Now, they have developed something fairly recently towards the end of 2021, draft recommendations on the ethics of artificial intelligence. And they are proposing a standard-setting instrument developed through a global approach based on international law, focusing on human dignity and human rights, as well as these other values of gender equality, social and economic justice, and environmental and ecosystem protection. And they look at AI technologies as raising some fundamental ethical concerns in terms of bias, in terms of threats to cultural diversity and social and economic divides, and in terms of the need for transparency and the understandability of algorithms and training data, because all of those may have a potential impact on human dignity, human rights, fundamental freedoms, and all the other things that we come to know and love, including animal welfare, environment, and the ecosystem. An interesting thing about the UNESCO draft recommendations is that the basis of it is not only based upon international, national, and national legal frameworks, but also as a way of connecting to ethical values, connecting ethical values and principles to the challenges and the opportunities linked to AI technology. The reason why they talk about values is that they say values play a powerful role as motivating ideals in shaping policy measures and legal norms. So they start at the value end in order to filter down into policy measures and legal norms. And they also talk about the values and principles being not only desirable per se, but, however, in any practical context, they may be in tension with each other. And that is insufficiently recognized whenever you see a list of ethical principles or ethical values and so on. Relatively few people are talking about the tensions that might arise between those and how those create wicked problems for resolution. So here UNESCO is pointing that out, I think very interestingly. Well, what are the values and principles that they themselves are promoting?
I just wanted to let you know it's just a couple of minutes more to go.
Oh, I'm sorry. I will try and hurry up then.
Thanks.
Okay. I want to get to my third part, which is on safety and security. These are values. These are the list of principles. You will note that safety and security are there. And I want to pick up very shortly on safety and security. They also made recommendations for a whole range of policy actions and areas. And we in the Alan Turing Institute, some of us are trying to look to see how those policy actions and areas can be developed and looked at in terms of ethical guidance. But their principle of safety and security, what do we mean by safety and security? I've been puzzled by this for many, many years, that they're very rarely defined or defined satisfactorily. There's SEN, the Standards Organization, giving a wide definition. UNESCO gives a narrow definition more towards privacy and data. But they say safe and secure AI without distinguishing as to whether safety and security are two separate values or whether they're synonyms, and certainly in some languages there's one word for both of them. Well, if we want to look more carefully at security and safety, we find there are many dimensions. There's physical safety, political, socioeconomic, cultural safety, national security, human security, information security. What do we mean when we talk about safety and security? Well, it has to be more specific than simply saying safety and security. going a bit further on this, there's objective security, the feeling of being secure, but there's the subjective security, the feeling of being secure or insecure. There's also so-called objective security, which based upon the probabilities of risk and almost numerical risk analysis. Now, in conflicts, which of these forms of security or safety should prevail if there are conflicts, as I mentioned before, but also can you really measure security? And if so, how much security do we need? How much safety do we need? Is there a concept of good enough safety, good enough security, or must it be 100%? We are told that countries' number one priority is the safety and security of their citizens. Well, yes and no. How much do citizens need? How much do they want? How much is feasible to devise? Here's some definitions of security. I'm not going to go into this because time is limited, but we need to have a wider definition of security away from national security, let us say, to human security, which is people-centered. The UN Human Rights document of 1994 talks about people-centered security. In recent constructs, we have privacy and security being seen as opposites. You can have privacy or you can have security. There's a quotation from Amitai Etzioni, who's a communitarian theorist. And he says that individualism is against communitarianism because individualism is the realm of rights, private choice, self-interest versus the common good. Well, his word versus ignores an awful lot, and I would take issue with Etzioni on this. Here's the Intelligence and Security Committee of the UK Parliament, which also makes the same kind of framing. They talk about, they say, in addition to considering whether the statutory framework governing access to private communications is adequate, the committee is considering the appropriate balance between our individual right to privacy and the collective right to security. And there are four difficulties with that. One is the definition of privacy and security. The others are the framing of it and what they mean by appropriate balance. I won't go into this one in too much detail, but again, how much privacy do we need? Whose privacy are we talking about? What's the social distribution of privacy? What's the social distribution of security? And shouldn't we pay attention to that in assessing the harms that something like AI can bring about? I would contend that privacy and security, or privacy and safety, have close affinities. Privacy itself is a security or a safety value. And there are a number of reasons that I've given there. I've written a paper or two on this if you want to see a further development of this. So in this sense, privacy and security of the society or of the state is really two takes on the public interest. It's not the individual versus society, whom should we favor, but rather which kind of public interest value should we favor? The public interest in privacy or the public interest in safety, if in fact there is a conflict between the two, and there needn't necessarily be. The Americans have got this a bit better. This is an American document under the Obama administration, where they say in American tradition, security has multiple meanings, and they get the point that it refers not only to national security, but also the right of people to be secure in their persons, houses, and papers, which is on the basis of which you have an awful lot of privacy legislation being developed. So the Americans understand the idea that privacy and security are not opposites, but that they go together. What do we mean by balance? Again, this is something I've been worrying away about for a long time, and I've written a fair amount on it if you want to have a look at it, but so have many other writers, and I've listed some sources there, including Hildebrandt and others. And the idea of balancing, while it has an element of truth, is also very misleading. So to conclude, two slides, if I'm allowed 1 minute, half a minute each. I think there's unfinished business in governing AI. We need to have more clarity on crucial things like risk, harm, safety, or security. What levels are we talking about of each? What social distribution, and so on. Clarity on what to regulate. Should we regulate technology or technological research or use or whatever? We need to have clarity on what is meant by accountability and responsibility and transparency. On whom should those values, should those requirements fall? We need clarity on ethics and redress of breaches of ethics, and we need clarity on the governance and the oversight and the regulation. Who is to regulate, what should be regulated, and where on the planet should that be regulated? And there are some unanswered questions in governing AI. Can ethical assumptions and practical proposals really be global and multicultural, or are they too Western-oriented and based upon Western values? The project that I'm working on in the Alan Turing Institute is looking at the UK and Japan in terms of human-machine interaction and looking at the values that underpin them in very different cultures. Also, will today's ethics be tomorrow's ethics? What is the stability of any list of ethical principles in the face of what we might be looking at tomorrow or the next day or the next century? And what are the limitations of law and technical design in regulating AI? What combination of regulatory instruments do we need, given that we don't only need law, but we need to have ethical principles to back it up and accompany it? And we also need some technological means, like things like data protection by default and by design. And how well are practitioners of AI trained to understand the social impacts of what they are doing? To what extent are they trained in their education, in their computer science degrees, in their early career work for companies? Do they get the point, and are they trained to get the point about social impacts? So I think that's where I am. I'm very sorry for taking a little bit of time, so I think we may only have time for a single espresso rather than a double espresso in the coffee break. But thank you very much. Thank you
very much, Charles.
Okay.
Is there someone with a question in the room? We just have 5 minutes for questions if somebody wants to. A question from someone watching our live stream. You may have already answered in your presentation. It was one of the open questions on the last slides. He or she is asking whether ethics are universal enough to be used globally, or at least supernationally, or aren't they too dependent on local societies and cultures?
Well, I think this is something that needs to be researched and needs to be determined, because sometimes we can stereotype cultures as being sui generis. Sometimes we can say here's the East and here's the West, and the Japanese or the Chinese or the Koreans are very different in the way they think about ethics from the way we in the West do. But if you look at the way we in the West, whoever we in the West are, there's all kinds of variations on these ethics and the contexts in which ethical norms, values, or principles might arise. And likewise, within societies in the so-called East, you not only have contextual and cultural differences within those blocks of cultures or countries, but also the context in which they arise. It isn't as though, I mean, for a long time people said, oh, the Japanese have no word for privacy. Okay, they don't have a word for privacy perhaps, but they certainly have a concept of what it means to be private and in what context privacy is a desirable thing for people to have. It may be a different set of desirabilities from the ones that people elsewhere in the world might have, and vice versa. But it doesn't mean that those values are strictly culture-bound and therefore not translatable or not communicable to other societies and cultures. But we're just beginning to scratch the surface on that. What is the meaning of the self in Western societies, plural? What's the meaning of the self in non-Western societies? What is the value of communal protection in an African society compared to communal protection within a Western or an Eastern society? I'm being very, very general on this because the research, the research-based answers are still being looked for and are still being found and investigated. So, but I think it's a very valid question to ask about whether we are so culture-bound that any attempt to have a global, 193 country ethical system might be regarded at the moment as a bit too ambitious.
Okay, thanks. Yes, I would suggest we conclude this session now. We have 20 minutes for our coffee break. Maybe the people watching from our live stream also take the chance to take a coffee instead of answering some emails. We will follow up at 4 o'clock with our panel discussion, and you're welcome to join us again on the live stream. And as I said before, there will be enough time to post some questions into the Q&A section of the live stream. Thank you.